Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Lambda School's free mini bootcamp course. Um, just a quick reminder of what we're doing here. If those of you that are joining us that are new tonight, this is Lambda School, where we offer a 6-month full bootcamp, or excuse me, full computer science education. But we're offering this free mini bootcamp right now, just to kind of give you a general idea of what kind of the tools and kind of the beginnings of what a web developer or software developer uses in their full-time everyday job. It's kind of just an introduction. We're covering HTML, CSS. We're deep diving into JavaScript. And then next week, towards the end, we are going to be kind of wrapping it all up and talking about DOM manipulation and building actually a little working little web application. So it kind of wraps everything up. This mini bootcamp is 12 lessons long, and it lasts 3 weeks. Tonight we're on our 7th lesson, so we've kind of surpassed that halfway mark. Those of you that are interested in joining our full Lambda School Academy of Computer Science, if you have not applied yet and are seeking a March 5th start date, it is imperative that you apply right away and you mention in your application or talk to the admissions staff and tell them that you're in the mini bootcamp course. We give preferential treatment to those that have taken and have gone through the mini bootcamp course because it shows you've taken initiative and it shows that you really care about learning this stuff. So make sure that you let the admissions staff know that you're in it. If you do want to start by March 5th, you're going to need to get your applications in as soon as possible. Spaces are filling up really quick. I think they told me today there's only a few spots left in the March 5th start date. So that start date is our 6-month Academy of Computer Science. In that course, it is full-time for 6 months. We cover kind of half is web development and half is computer science. So you really get this full spectrum of software development instruction and these skills that are really just lead you to be a job-ready software developer. And that's our goal. And that's your goal, obviously, if you're taking the course, is by the end, we want you to be ready to go directly into the field and be a software developer at that point. Through our awesome ISA income share agreement, we're able to offer this course for free up front. So that gives us the incentive to make you the best software developer you can possibly be, because we don't get paid until you get a job. And so it's a really awesome and unique opportunity that we're allowed to provide. We have world-class instructors, and their job is to make you as career ready as possible. And so that starts the first Monday of each month. Our next one is starting on March 5th. And like I said, if you plan on starting on that March 5th date or would like to apply for that March 5th date, get your applications in as soon as possible, because we are running out of space really quickly, especially with all of you that have already applied and are going through the interview process right now. Other than that, we are in our mini bootcamp course. Like I said, we're on lesson 7 today. So we spent the last 3 lessons talking about JavaScript, and we're actually going to spend the next 3 lessons talking about JavaScript. It's that important in web development and in software development currently to have these really great understandings. Once you're through this course, you're going to be kind of the baseline of where we need you to be and where we want you to be, well, all of our students to be, to enter our full-time course. So we're going to start getting into a little bit more advanced topics over the next few lessons. This is stuff that doesn't come super easy. You're going to have to put in a little bit of work, a lot of work, actually. We have staff standing by in all of our Slack channels. So during this course, if you would like to ask me a question on air, please post that in the questions channel, and I'll get to those either as we go or at the end of the lesson tonight. If you have a question about a specific assignment or just help in general, see one of our lessons channels. So each lesson has their own Slack channel, lessons 1 through 12. And so tonight is lesson 7. And so enter the lesson 7 channel and ask in there. And we have some great staff standing by, including myself, and also other students that have gone through the mini boot camp, or even full-time students in the course right now that want to lend their hand to help all of you. So there's a lot of help out there to get through these exercises, and a lot of help out there to understand the subject matter in a better way. So we're going to get started with our lesson tonight. Let me share my screen. All right, so we have our Replit up here. So let's talk of just a little quick overview of what we did last night and kind of how we ended up where we are right now. So last night we talked about arrays, and we had talked about how to instantiate an array, with names. We had student names, and arrays are just this bracket. We learned that arrays can hold collections of data. So it's like a container that holds collections of data. And normally when we talk about arrays, we're holding data that kind of all is related to each other. They're kind of all the same thing. So as we said last night, we had a student's names array. We have the names of different students in the class in the array. Right? And so, we can have all of this data that is sort of connected to each other. It's related to each other in some sort of way, and we can hold all that data in one really nice, neat place. So we'll have access to student names the entire time. We learned about push and pop, shift and unshift, a way to add and remove items from our array, whether it be on the front or the back. In the case of push and pop, it's on the back, and shift and unshift is off the front. And so we learned about those array methods. We learned about the length property, and that we can we can ask it for the length of that array. Right now we can see our array, so we can count the amount of items in it. Oftentimes when we're working with programs, we don't see the actual array. We're just given the variable that we know is an array, and we can ask it for the length, and it gives us back the amount of items in the array. And so that's what the length property does. And it's a little bit different from the string.length property, and the string.length gives you all of the characters in that string, whereas the array.length gives you all of the items. We talked about how arrays aren't typed, so you can have whatever type you want in there. We can say just numbers, right? And we can just have an array of numbers. I want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And remember that all items in an array are separated by a comma. That tells the computer that those are 2 different items. Obviously, if you have something like that, we'll get an error on here, right? So you might get a missing syntax error, something like that. So all items in an array are separated by, oops, that's numbers, a comma. So arrays are great in that they hold these collections of data. Tonight, we're going to talk about objects. And objects are a specific data type in JavaScript. And we're going to do an introduction to objects. We're going to talk about some methods that are available to objects, just as we had push and pop and shift and unshift for arrays. We have different methods for objects. We're going to talk about a unique looping syntax for objects. Then we're going to hop into a topic that starts to get a little more advanced, and it's this keyword, and we'll go into that more in depth. And then we'll kind of talk about how objects really bring everything together in JavaScript and why that is. So, as we were talking earlier, arrays tend to contain collections of like items, right? So not always, but that's kind of how we see it, is that an array is a collection of items that are kind of related to each other. They have something in common. Well, objects are kind of a little more refined than that. So an object is a collection of data that's all about one thing. And so all the data that we have in there is all about one thing. They both hold items that are related to each other, but objects just hold information about one thing. And so to create an object, let's go Dan. I'm going to create a Dan object. That's me. Oops, got ahead of myself. To create an object, instead of using the brackets like we did for an array, we use these curly braces. And so if you're looking for the curly braces, it's on a Mac, it's kind of, you have to shift and hit the bracket. On Windows, I'm sure it's similar, but I don't have a Windows keyboard in front of me right now. And so when the computer sees these curly braces, they know that that means you are about to, that you have created an object. Just remember that you always have to have an open and a closing curly brace, or else you're going to get an error somewhere along the line. So now we have our first object, right? It's the name. We've given it the name of Dan. It's a constant, so we can't make Dan equal to anything else. And we've told the computer that we're creating an object. So now this is a new object. I'll get rid of that, excuse me. And so now we want to add data to this object. And so to add data, we use something called a key value pair. Whereas in an array, we can say, Dan, Sarah, that Dan was an index of 0, and Sarah was an index of 1. We actually get to name our keys, our indexes in objects. And so to do that, we use what's called a key value pair. So let's start out. So within your object, you first write the name of the key. And the name of the key doesn't have quotes around it. It doesn't have anything. It's just the name of the key. So let's say this is my object for, a website somewhere, and I want a username. So my username, you write the key of username. After the key, you give it a colon, and then you give it a value. And the value can be any JavaScript data type, just like how we saw in arrays, that arrays could be strings, numbers, booleans. They can be other arrays. They can be objects. Objects work the same way. They can take any JavaScript data type. And so let's just give my username of dan.frainer, which is my first and last name. And that's our first key value pair. So our key, a colon, and a value, which can be any JavaScript data type. So in this case, we've used a string, and that string is dan.frainer. And so we can add as many key value pairs to an object as we want, just like arrays. All right, we can add as many names to those arrays. We can add as many numbers to those arrays. We can add as many key value pairs to an object as we want. Just like an array, in order to separate the two data types, the two items, we use a comma. Okay, so in ES6, we're allowed to use a comma at the end of any key value pair, even if it's the last one on here. And I just recommend throwing that comma out there because that is one of the most common errors that students get. Are they, create a bunch of key value pairs, and then they forget a comma somewhere. and they don't know why it's broken. They're getting syntax error, unexpected token. It's because they've missed a comma. So just make sure that after every value, you throw a comma on there. That separates the key value pairs. That makes the JavaScript transpiler very happy. And so we can add as many values as we want, key value pairs as we want. Let's say I need a password. And so my password is, don't steal this from me, it's my password, ABC123. And you see, I just threw the comma out there. It'll just get into the habit of putting the comma out there. And so we can add as many key value pairs as we want. There are some stipulations to key value pairs, though, and how many we add. The first stipulation is that no two keys can be the same. Okay, so keys are always unique. So if I went in here and I tried to add a username key, and I said that it was Frainer Dan, we're going to see an error here, duplicate key. So keys cannot be the same. Keys have to be unique. Just make sure that when you're creating objects, that all of your keys are unique. That being said, values don't have to be unique. You can have as many unique keys as you want pointing to the same exact value, and that's okay. And we'll go over kind of why that is a little bit later. But you can have, password could be, although, well, neither of them are good passwords, but they can all be the same value as long as the key is unique. Okay, just keep that in mind. So it's going to be ABC 1, 2, 3. And just like in arrays, our value can be any data type it wants. Loves JavaScript. And we can have a Boolean in there. A favorite number. We can have a number in there. We could even have an array in there. We can have an object, another object in there. We can even have functions, and we'll go over tomorrow what a function in an object is. We'll go over it today. Never mind. We can have any data type we want as our value in an object. So we also have the ability, just like in arrays, to access and assign our keys and our values in here. So we have created a new object that's called Dan, and it's my user object, right? So this is just, imagine I'm on a website somewhere, and this is the object that's stored for my data. Just like arrays, we can access it with brackets, but we also have a new way of accessing the data in an object, and we call that dot notation. And so dot notation is going to call the object itself. So in this case, the object's name is Dan. And then we use dot, and we use the exact key that we want. So in this case, we'll just use username. And what this is going to do is it's going to look inside of the Dan object for the key of username. And we'll see that it returns dan.frainer. We can do this with any of the keys we have in there. Number, we'll see 42 comes up. This is called dot notation. So this is by far the most common way of accessing values in an object. And it's kind of the most straightforward. You just give it a dot and the name of the key you want. We can, just like in arrays, use a bracket to access values. If you use a bracket to access values, you have to include a data type. If I said username in here, it's going to look for username as a variable. So I have to wrap that in quotes in order to use the brackets. And now we can do it. See, if we don't have those quotes, it'll say username is not defined because it's looking for a variable. Whatever is in between these brackets, it's going to read as a data type, right? That being said, if I did have a username, uname, I'll call it uname, equals the string of username, and I included that variable in here, that variable points to a string called username. So now it's going to look on the Dan object for a key called username, and we'll get that back. Bracket notation is really only going to be used when you're using a variable to look up a name. And that does happen often where you're given an object and you don't know what, you have no idea what keys are on it. And you're given a variable with a, and you don't even know what the variable is pointing to. That's how you would look up a key or a property on an object. So brings me to a good point right here is that key and property, you're going to hear interchanged a lot. They're the same exact thing. So if you hear me say property, just know that that means key. If you hear me say key, just know that that means property. They're the same exact thing. So I don't want to confuse anyone by bringing in some extra language, but you will read about JavaScript on the internet, you will talk to people about it, and they will use the terms key and property interchangeably. So just a little side note there. I want to make sure that everyone understands that when we use brackets, it's really only going to be so that we can use variables inside to look up properties on an object. If you know the name of what you're looking up, use dot notation. It's far easier, it's much less complicated. But if you don't know the name or you only have a variable to what the property or the key name is, then use bracket notation and use that. Let's change this to password. So now we have this variable is pointing to a string called password. So you can just imagine where it says the name of the variable, it's just replaced by that string. And now we can see that it looks up the password. So that's dot and bracket notation. Just want to kind of grind it into your brains a little bit that if you know the name of the key, use dot notation. It's much easier. If you have to use a variable to look up the key, use bracket notation. Those are the kind of the two times that you're going to use each. For the most part, you will be using bracket notation. So just like an array, we can also use, this username. We can also use this notation to, first of all, to access values. We can also use it to assign values, to reassign values or assign values. And so in this case, I changed my username, right? So I'm in a function that's called change username, and it takes an object and it wants you to change the username to the new username. And I wanted it, I like my username to be D Frainer instead of Dan Frainer. And so now I can say, I've taken that object, I've access to the key using dot notation, and now I've used the assign. The single equals means assign, so I've used the assign to assign it to something new. And so let's do what we did yesterday, and we can go console log before, and let's go console log after. Okay. And in between those, I'm giving that username a new assignment. Oops, console helps if you spell things right. So now we can see the before. has a username of Dan.Frainer and has all the other parts of the object. And afterwards, we see that the username has just dfrainer because we've used it to assign a new name to it, right? We can use the assignment to also add new keys. So let's say I already have those stuff. Something new. City. So the user, what city they're in, and I'm currently in Salt Lake City, Utah. And so now, even though that key is nowhere on this object, what JavaScript is going to do is it's going to look up that key. It's going to say, I don't find it. So then it's going to add the key to the object. And now we'll see that we have username, Dan Frainer, password, ABC123, the whole object as we've given it. And afterwards, it's added that key into that key value pair into that object. We can also do this using bracket notation as well. So just like before, we have to include an actual data type in there. So in this case, we're giving it username. And I want to just change this to dfrainer. And so just like using dot notation, I can use bracket notation. And something I failed to point out, but I want to just make this ultra clear to everyone. I'll just show you, again, our best use case for using bracket notation will be using a variable inside of there to act as a key. And we see that it does the same thing, username Dan Frainer, afterwards dfrainer. I want to show you what happens when you try to use a variable with dot notation. It doesn't work. So when the computer is reading this, it's saying the object Dan dot, okay, I'm looking for a key, and then it's going to look up the key uname, and it's going to look up the exact key on here, and it's not going to find anything called uname. So then it's going to, then it's going to come back with an error. Oh, that's what we'll do. Log it. Undefined. So there's undefined on there. We're like, oh, why is it undefined? We see that username equals or uname equals username. But in order to use a variable, we have to use bracket notation. Let's just kind of get rid of these real quick just to point this out. There we go. We using it with bracket notation, we see it's giving us the right thing. Using it with dot notation, it's looking for that as the key name. It's not reading it as a variable and not reading it as username. And we're getting undefined. So if you're running into issues with your code coming back undefined or something not working, make sure that if you're using a variable to look up a key, that you're using brackets. Cool. So we've talked about accessing and assigning key value pairs. Let's talk real quick about removing key value pairs. So to say something false. So say you have a key value pair on an object that you no longer want. Let's go console log. Before and so we have something on here like, say this. We don't want that on that object anymore. There's a couple of different ways to do it. The first way, the way that it actually removes the entire key value pair is to use the delete keyword. So we can say delete, and the name of the object, and the name of the key. Let's run it. See, we have something false on there in the before, and something false has gone in the after. So we can use the delete keyword to delete a key value pair from the object. It's kind of one of those things where there's a couple of different ways to do it, and it depends on who you're working with and for, and what your team is using essentially. But a lot of times, especially in Node.js and backend, you will see number. You will see instead of the delete keyword, the developer will just assign something to undefined. And you'll see that the favorite number is still on there, but if you look it up, it'll return undefined. So it's really up to you, but in our assignment, we're looking for the use of the delete keyword. So as I said before, we can have any data type we want in an object. Let's see, we're going to go. We can have an array. We can have an object, another object in there. We can also have functions as our values. And when we have a function as our value, we call that function a method. So we'll just call this say hi method. I'm going to delete these because they serve no purpose on there. So we have our key, just like before. We have our colon, and then afterwards, we can just write a function in here. And we're going to write what we call an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name technically when we write the function syntax out, although we have given it a name. It's right here, right? But we just write that like we would without giving it a name. And then we can have whatever we want. Let's go return hi everyone. And so to use a function in an object, is to use that method, what we need to do is we need to call our object. We use our dot syntax. We use say hi method. And then in order to put the keys in that function and turn it on, in order to make it run, we have to use those parentheses afterwards. And this is what this is going to do is this is going to go into the object and it's going to look up the say hi method, whatever that key is. Oh, it's a function. And now it's going to say run that function using those parentheses. And we'll see that we get hi everyone out of it. So that's called a method. And we're going to be using methods quite a bit, especially in the next few lessons. And we're going to get a little bit more advanced than we are right now. But just know that a method is when you put a function inside of an object as a value. So just keep that in mind. And I'm actually going, no, I'll leave that on there. No, I'm going to take that off. We'll just comment that out. So the next thing we're going to talk about is a unique looping syntax for objects. If you remember, we wrote our for loop last night, and we had, this less than array.length I plus plus. This works really well if you have numerical indexes that are in order, and you can just loop through an entire array using numerical index. Objects, I can't say let I equal username and I equals, there's no way to really loop over that very well. JavaScript gives us a little helping hand with it. We had talked about it a little bit last night, and it's called a for in loop. And for in loops should only be used on objects. They should not be used on arrays because, first of all, for in loops do not guarantee the order, and neither do objects. Objects don't guarantee that the order that you put things in is the order that you're going to get it out. Also, for in loops is a little bit more advanced, but when we talk about prototypes in a couple of lessons, everything has a prototype to it, and for in loops will grab stuff out of that prototype. So just know that this is for objects only. So just like in our regular for loop, we instantiate a variable. And usually when you're writing a for in loop, you're going to call the variable key. Just like we have I as our convention for regular for loops, key is our convention for in loops. So we just write let key, and then we get this cool syntax here, and we just say in and the name of the object. Okay, that's it. That's our entire thing. JavaScript takes care of the rest for us. It goes and it loops over every single key in that object and it stops. There's no possibility of running an infinite loop with a for in loop. There's no possibility of missing anything. It just goes in. It has one specific job, to go in and grab each key out of that object. That's it. Do something and loop back around and grab the next key. So let's go look at it. To log key. So, oops. Now we see that it's gone in each loop and grabbed first the username, that's the username key, the password key, the loves JavaScript key, and the favorite number key, and then it ends automatically. Now that we have access to these keys, we can then use them to access the values in the objects as well. So we can say Dan, and then since key is a variable and it changes every time, if I were to say key Dan.key, what would it do? It would look in the Dan object for a key, and there is none. There's username, password, loves JavaScript, favorite food. In this case, we have to use our bracket notation because we're using a variable to look up our key value pairs. And so now we can go through it and see all the values. So what is Dan username? Is Dan Frainer. What is Dan password? ABC123. What is Dan loves JavaScript? True. Favorite number 42, etc. And it loops through them all and gives you access to all of the keys and the values. And we can console log key. And let's do this. Key. So we can console log multiple items at the same time. So first we're going to get the key, and then we're going to get the value. Now we say username, Dan Frainer, password, ABC123, loves JavaScript, true, favorite number 42. So you see, using that key only and using the object, using a for in loop, we get access to both the key and the value in there. That's a for in loop there. All right, we're going to come back to our method and talk about kind of an advanced topic, and it's advanced because we're going to talk about it a lot more over the next few lessons, but it gets very tricky very quick. But at the beginning right here, this is going to be pretty easy going. Makes a lot of sense at the very beginning. And that topic is the this keyword. It is called this. So every object has access to something called this, and it's self-referential. So if we use it in, let's go, use it in a method here. Let's just do return this. It refers to the object itself. It refers to this whole object. So we can't say something like username in here. So Dan dot say hi method, and it says return username. It's going to say username is not defined. Well, how do we get access to the username if we want to use it on a method? we use the this keyword. And this refers to this entire object. So we can say this dot username now. And we can see when I say hi method, let's see it returns the username from that object. And we can go use a little bit of string concatenation here. So that string plus space and says hi. Now we can see that we have access to the username. We have access to all of the keys inside of the object. And that is the this keyword. Okay, just remember that this refers to the object that it's inside. Like I said, it's going to be one of the more difficult topics that you learn in JavaScript because we're using it in a very basic way right here. But when we start talking about classes and we start creating objects that have objects inside of them, that have methods on them, it gets a little bit confusing. But just for now, just remember that this keyword means the object that it's inside. So, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about objects, and there's a really good reason for why we spend so much time talking about the objects. In this lesson, we've learned about methods, about keys or properties. We learn how to assign values, to access the values using bracket and dot notation. And a lot of this stuff looks kind of familiar to what we have been working on this entire time, these last other 3 lessons before this. Arrays, you can access an array using bracket notation. Arrays have methods on them. Right? Strings have properties. And it kind of, patterns start to form. And that's because this concept that every single thing in JavaScript is an object. Might not make a lot of sense right now, and I really don't expect it to, and I really don't want you to dwell on this, but everything in JavaScript is an object. Arrays are objects, strings are objects, numbers are objects, booleans are objects. They have their own built-in methods, they have their own built-in properties, they have their own built-in functions. Functions are objects with their own special properties. In fact, the entire JavaScript runtime, everything that this is run inside of is an object. We have on a browser, if you open a browser window, it's known as window. Is the object. If you open window, you can see all of the different JavaScript objects that are available to us. If you're running Node on a server, it's called global. And the more we work with JavaScript, the more this is going to start to make sense. Right now, you might just be like, what is he even talking about? But the more we work with JavaScript, the more it will start to make sense to us. Just keep it in your mind, just in the back of your mind. And when you see a pattern form, you're like, how does it work like this? Just think about how an object works, and that's how we used it. So anytime you think of a property or a method and you don't know whether to put parentheses on the end of a method, just think, what's a method in an object? It's a function. In order to run a function, we need parentheses. So let's put those parentheses. What's a property or a key on an object? Oh, it's just, a key value pair. We don't need parentheses to access length because it's a property. Things like that are going to start to make more sense. So just watch as these patterns emerge. Don't dwell on this too much. I've had students dwell far too much on this, but just know that that's kind of why we talk about objects so much in JavaScript, because everything is an object. And that concludes our lesson for tonight. I want to open it up to questions. If you do have a question, please feel free to throw it into Slack in the questions channel, and I will get to them. Let's see what we got here. I see that there is does a key value pair as a pair make up the property? So when we refer to a property on an object, we are just referring to the key, right? So the key username is also the property username on the object. Those two words are interchangeable. Okay. Yep. Okay. All right, we got a question. What if we didn't know we needed to add a GitHub on our application, but we're doing the boot camp? Message me and tell me your GitHub username, and I'll take care of it. And your full name and your email. Message me with your username, full name, and email. Why are objects mainly used? That is a much lower level question and much, much, much more advanced, and something that you will start to uncover the more you work with JavaScript. It's just the style that they wrote the language in. JavaScript is not a true object-oriented language, and you might hear that kind of word thrown around there, that phrase, object-oriented language. But it's kind of modeled after an object-oriented language. And you think of the words object-oriented, that everything's an object. So, language like C# or Java, which are true object-oriented languages, everything is an object as well. And that's kind of how JavaScript was modeled. Let's get some more questions in the questions channel. Okay, so why when a key has a function assigned to it, it's the whole thing called a method. That is just the language we use to describe a function as a value on an object is a method. It is. We can say a function as a value on an object, or we can say a method. It's just the language that we use makes it called a method. There's no fancy anything that goes with it. It's literally just a key. And okay, so let's say this. A property is any key on an object that does not point to a function. Okay, so that would be a property. Any key on an object that does not point to a function, that does not have a function as its value. A method is a key that has a function at its value. Cool, that's actually a good clarification I need to bring up in the future. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you guys very much for joining me for lesson 7 today. We learned about objects. There's a lot of fun activities in the assignment tonight. So lesson 7 assignment, and I'll put the new test line we need to use for testing in Slack right now. For those of you that are kind of newer, there's some discrepancies in the Slack README that talks about how to test something. And so please just copy paste the line I post in the general channel in Slack to test tonight's assignment. Other than that, thank you guys very much for joining us tonight. Lambda School's free mini boot camp, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. We'll start talking about some more advanced JavaScript tomorrow. Have a good night, everybody.